Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on sexual harassment in the workplace, how to prevent it and how to handle allegations like a professional. My name is Pamela Meals, and I will be your moderator today. I'm very pleased to introduce our esteemed panel of presenters. First, I'd like to welcome Melissa Cabo-Sabula, VP Corporate Communications at National Public Relations, one of Canada's leading PR firms. Melissa brings more than 15 years of experience counseling Canadian politicians and business leaders and works closely with C-suite leaders on advancing business strategy through reputation management, issues and crisis planning, stakeholder engagement, and executive visibility. Melissa has worked with clients in industries as diverse as arts and culture, healthcare and food service on issues in crisis preparedness and execution. In recent years, she has worked with a variety of companies on updating codes of conduct and internal policies specific to workplace conduct, securing critical organizational buy-in for changes to preparedness policies, response procedures, messaging, and materials. Prior to joining National, Melissa spent several years as a political advisor. She served as a legislative assistant to a federal member of parliament, worked in the communication arm of the Conservative Party War Room, and was a senior special assistant to the Minister of Industry, where she was responsible for legislative affairs and communications. Thank you for being here, Melissa. Next, I'd like to welcome Melissa's colleague at National, Jane Tabor, VP Public Affairs. Jane's a veteran journalist. She worked for more than 30 years as a print and broadcast journalist, spending the majority of her career as a political reporter and columnist on Parliament Hill and at Queen's Park. For 6 years, she was co-host of CTV's Question Period, an hour-long political affairs program on CTV's main network. She spent 14 years at the Globe and Mail, 10 of which were spent as a columnist and senior reporter in the Globe's Ottawa Bureau. She filled in as co-host on Canada AM and was the backup host for Mike Duffy Live and CTV's Power Play. She has appeared as a guest panelist on CBC's At Issue panel. Jane knows all the players in today's media. She is a prolific writer and has worked on crisis communication. With experience on all platforms and in the rapidly changing media landscape, Jane also provides the most comprehensive and up-to-date media training. Since joining National in August 2016, Jane has worked on key files, including helping government spokespeople, senior executives, and CEOs prepare for dealing with the media, both in proactive and reactive situations. Very pleased to welcome you here today, Jane.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Dawn Jack, partner at Aird Berlis. In a career spanning more than 3 decades, Dawn has argued cases at every court level, including the Supreme Court of Canada. As a member of the firm's Litigation and Dispute Resolution Group, Dawn's litigation practice includes the area of commercial, administrative, class action, private, international, family, and constitutional law. He has acted as lead counsel in several precedent-setting cases. Dawn has received numerous accolades over a successful career, including Lexpert's 100 Most Creative Lawyers in Canada, and for numerous years has been recognized in the best lawyers in Canada in the fields of alternative dispute resolution, corporate, and commercial litigation. Thank you for joining us, Dawn. Our next panelist is Megan Cowan, associate at Aird Berlis. Megan is a member of the firm's Litigation and Dispute Resolution Group, Labor and Employment Group, and Privacy and Data Security Group. She advises on a variety of litigation matters with a focus on privacy and labor and employment law, including wrongful dismissal litigation, human rights, and labor relations. Given her wealth of knowledge in the employment arena, she is a regular presenter on webinars hosted by our firm's Labor and Employment Group. Thank you for being here, Meg. And that leaves me. As I previously stated, my name is Pamela Meals. I'm a partner at Aird Berlis in the Litigation Group and co-chair of the firm's Women's Initiative Committee. I have a broad commercial litigation practice that includes an emphasis on contractual disputes, short-term and long-term disability claims, and life insurance claims. Employment issues are a key component of my disability claims practice, so I'm very interested in speaking to this well-regarded panel today about this important topic. Few issues are more difficult to navigate and effectively deal with in today's era of MeToo or have a greater potential to harm an employer's reputation than sexual harassment allegations in the workplace. We will learn today that employers must do everything possible to make it clear that they are dealing with these sensitive matters fairly and quickly in accordance with applicable legal requirements. Media coverage of these issues can be very damaging as well. We are going to talk about a few examples today, including Jazz FM and Soul Pepper, but unfortunately there are many more examples. The MeToo movement has highlighted the importance of organizations to ensure not only that they have appropriate policies in place with respect to harassment and sexual misconduct, but a process as well to effectively address the complaints in a manner that is both sensitive and fair. Don, would you like to start us off on discussing the significance of these issues in today's workplace and giving us examples of the Jazz and Soul Pepper issues?
Yes, certainly. Jazz FM is an unfortunate example, it appears, of what not to do. There seems to have been, just looking at the media coverage, I don't have any inside information, seems to have been an unfortunate failure to come forward in an open and transparent way and state, particularly to donors, because it's very donor dependent, what was going on. As I understand it, they're now locked in litigation even over the conduct of their most recent annual meeting. Very, very bad reputationally and expensive legally. Soul Pepper seemed to have done its best to try to deal with the severe problem that arose, but it too is fighting to survive, and it has incurred very significant legal expenses. So there are dangers here which can strike actually at the existential being of the organization that gets swept up in this. Well, I'll turn this over to Jane as well, because I think she has some comments too.
Yeah, thank you very much, Don. I appreciate that. Yeah, so it's very interesting to that we're at we're in a law office, we're at a legal webinar, but that Aird Berlis is invited in, the communications people, myself and my colleague Melissa, because I think a lot of times communications get forgotten in these issues, and we are here not to lead a process, but we're here to support a process. So against that background, let's just talk a little bit about Me Too. As Pamela mentioned off the top in the first slide, this the hashtag started to go viral in 2017. And believe it or not, it was only in October 2017. It's just a year ago, and it seems to me it was much longer than that the Harvey Weinstein issue first broke, and that really broke open the doors on this whole thing. He is still before the courts. There's still court action that's going on as a result of Harvey Weinstein. But Canada has not been immune to this. Don't think that for a moment. Just recently, just a few weeks ago, we saw the situation at St. Mike's School with the bullying and sexual harassment of some students there, some male students there. That is still being dealt with. Don mentioned Jazz FM, Soul Pepper Theatre. There's more examples of that come to mind as well. TVO with Steve Paikin, and all of this has started since October. It is still continuing. It has not stopped. It doesn't feel though that the media coverage is as intense. But what we have learned, if you look through the timeline of events, is what we have learned from a communications perspective and a media perspective is that there has to be transparency. There has to be accountability. The players, the principals in these situations have to get out in front of it. And I think that a lot has to be done even before something like this happens in an organization. You have to bulletproof your organization and have some sort of plan so you know how to proceed. Because in the cases that we're seeing now, there was a lack of transparency. There's a lack of accountability. The processes that were in place for complaining or bringing forward a matter of a sexual harassment complaint, the processes weren't there in a lot of cases. In the Soul Pepper example, the woman who was in charge was married to Albert Scholz, who was the person at the center of the allegations. And the other thing is, I'm sure we'll be talking about this later, is that where is due process in all of this when these allegations get onto social media? Steve Paikin from TVO is a great example of getting in front of the story. He went out on Facebook and talked about it and said that he was innocent. He was going to fight it for all that he was worth. And sure enough, I think the allegations were made against him in February, and by April he was cleared. And so that was a successful outcome, and that's an example of a communicator getting in front of this. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jane. Dawn, did you want to talk about the risks encountered by employers in this situation where there are workplace harassment allegations?
Certainly. In addition to the reputational risks, which are very clear, and Jane has just pointed that out, and we'll be coming back to that, there is the risk of being sued either before the Human Rights Commission here in Ontario or in the courts. And there's the risk of having to pay, and if there are multiple claimants, pay significant damages. There are legal expenses. And when the matter gets into the court system or before the Human Rights Commission, then, of course, there is ongoing reputational risk because the case, as it trundles its way through one of those systems, gets media coverage. So there are significant risks, and as you will be hearing as we move on through this seminar, trying to prevent the problem in the first place, having proper systems in place, and Megan will be speaking to those, is very, very, very important. And having a command structure in place to deal with an emergency, if it nonetheless occurs, is very important as well.
Great, thanks, Dawn. Jane, did you want to touch again on the reputational issues to employers in these situations?
Yeah, thanks, Pam. So, I might be going over a few things that I had mentioned before, but just to be clear, when you're in a crisis situation and the communications support comes in, as I said before, the communicator should be in at the very beginning of the process supporting what is going on. But what we often find in crisis situations is that there is no crisis plan in place, and as Dawn had mentioned, talking about proper structures and processes, those are not there, and it's after the fact that an organization will come to national, a PR agency to help them with the crisis communications, and after the fact put a plan in place. So let's be a little bit proactive, and let's think about this. With the plan in place, that helps in dealing with the crisis in its broader form. So response time. If you have a plan in place, you know that you've got to respond probably within a few hours to the event. In Australia, I think it is. There's legislation, or this could be apocryphal, but governments, organizations, departments respond within something like 13 minutes. And we saw with Mark Zuckerberg in his Facebook crisis situation with Cambridge Analytica that he responded in 5 days. That's not good. And this is not good in a situation when you're dealing with a MeToo complaint. I've got here emphasizes the importance of relationship building with the media. If you have relationships with the media and something like this has happened, there's a go-to person. You have a trustworthy relationship established with a reporter or an editor, and even if they're not going to be doing a story, they're the people that you can go to and say, hey, my client wants to speak about this. How can we get that out there? And with that kind of relationship, you would probably have a better a better presentation before the media, because you do have that relationship. Training to deal with media in crisis, again, this is all proactive. This is all getting in front of the story and getting in front of the narrative. Because if your voice is in this 24/7 media world and social media, if your voice is not in there, somebody else's voice will be. The void is always filled. People are really, content is king. People want content, and if you're not in there, somebody else will be in there. So you want to get your voice in there and be part of the narrative. Also in crisis communication, sometimes you don't want to poke the bear and react too strongly or too aggressively. So there's ways of measuring what your reaction can be, and this is just analyzing what the conversations are going on, what the conversations are on social media, how engaged people are, and that can then determine or inform the kind of response that you're going to give in the media. So those are the kinds of things and tactics that employers can use to help with their reputation.
So as Dawn and Jen have already touched on, a MeToo crisis has the potential to impact your organization in a very public way. The way you handle a crisis will determine how you're perceived by clients, customers, employees, competitors, and other stakeholders. If it is not handled correctly, how people view your organization's integrity and values could affect reputation in the long term. So there are 4 common reputational risks associated with MeToo. The first is a negative impact on relationships with key external stakeholders if they feel that the situation is not clearly understood or that the organization is not acting effectively. There's also the potential negative impact on internal stakeholders and employees. If they feel they work for an organization that doesn't take MeToo issues seriously, they could question the integrity of your organization, impacting employee morale and retention. Second, an ineffective response could and often does result in an organization being perceived as incompetent, which can extend to how people perceive other aspects of your operations. And with that, there's naturally a potential competitive disadvantage that flows from reputational damage and ineffective management of an issue, which can impact the bottom line. And if a situation isn't dealt with swiftly from the outset, the length of time required to bring full resolution to the issue will be extended, which can lead to prolonged reputational risks. So with that in mind, there are 6 critical steps to managing a MeToo crisis or a potential MeToo crisis, a number of which have already been touched on, but I will spend a little bit more time on them. The first one is to be proactive. You really cannot be too proactive. A key component of crisis management, as both Dawn and Jane have touched on already, is proactively identifying vulnerabilities. So past allegations and settlements can still come to light even after an employee has left an organization, so it's critical to have a sense of those existing vulnerabilities. Reviewing existing policies and procedures. Not only is it critical to have effective policies in place, if you do end up dealing with a MeToo crisis, being able to hold up those policies to support communication around the company's commitments to zero tolerance will be critical. Third, developing or updating, if one already exists, your issues and crisis plan. Updates should reflect MeToo scenarios and should include core elements of crisis communications plan, such as information on key internal stakeholders, how and when to share information, protocols for dealing with media, draft messaging and holding statements, among other things. Alongside updating your crisis plan, as Dawn already alluded to, a war room or a committee should be struck to secure alignment among all relevant stakeholders internally on policies and processes. That same group should serve as the key decision-making group if your organization ends up dealing with a MeToo crisis. Fifth, be transparent and authentic. If you are managing a MeToo crisis or any crisis, internal and external communication should be authentic and should be a reflection of how seriously the organization is taking the issue while communicating what will be done moving forward to prevent it from happening. Lastly, proactively communicate and engage stakeholders on your course of action. If you are dealing with a MeToo crisis that has gone public, don't wait until it gains more momentum in the media. If it's become public or is likely to go public based on the nature of it, proactively communicate to key stakeholders what is being done to address the situation.
That's great. Thank you, Melissa and Jane, for the reputational issues to employers in this difficult situation. Megan, can you talk about the legal duties of employers and to whom they're owed?
Sure, thanks, Pam. Really, it's twofold here. I mean, in the face of a complaint or an allegation in the workplace, the employer owes a duty both to the complainant to ensure that their issue that they're raising is investigated in a fair manner, but also to the respondent, the person that was alleged to have conducted the offhand conduct. They have to provide a reasonable, fair, and transparent mechanism to determine the facts. So in the presentation later, I'll be going through some of the legislative requirements that this entails. That includes the Ontario Human Rights Code, as well as the Ontario Occupational Health and Safety Act. Now, while these are Ontario-centric, every province essentially has similar legislation, so my comments will apply Canada-wide, as I know we have listeners today from all across the country.
That's great. Thanks, Meg. Dawn, did you want to talk about the inherent difficulty of sorting out the facts in these difficult situations?
Yeah, there can. Megan has quite properly touched upon the duties of fairness both to the complainant and the person against whom the complaint is made. Sometimes it's difficult to figure out what happened. So you have to have in place, and Megan will go through the details of this a little later, mechanisms for investigation and determining what happened and determining then what steps should be done in view of the determination of what happened. But underlying it may be some difficulty in figuring out what the facts are to begin with. And we've had some questions sent in, including how to handle the he said, she said situations, how to determine the validity of the accusation, and so on and so forth. We will be coming to this a little later on, but our suggestion is to have an add-on to what the statutory law already requires, and which Megan will be explaining. An odd add-on when the organization can't determine or doesn't feel comfortable in itself determining what happened, an add-on of a mediation arbitration before a very senior and experienced person, preferably a former judge. The add-on is to determine those cases which can't be determined by the organization all by itself, is designed to be perceived as fair, and person presiding over it being totally unbiased and being experienced in making factual determinations. And that is why we would be suggesting a former judge, and we would be, as part of our service to the client in such a situation, arranging that mediation arbitration before a person who can be trusted to do a good job with it.
Great. Thank you, Don. And we will touch on that later, but thank you for the benefits of the mediation arbitration. And Megan, can we turn back to you, and can you explain to us why all this is necessary?
Sure. Thanks, Pam. So really today I'm going to be walking through the legislative context here in Ontario, and as I said, what I speak about today really does apply to every other province in Canada. So when organizations face allegations of harassment or bullying, there's a variety of forums that these complaints can go through, through the Ministry of Labour, through the Human Rights Tribunal, and through a civil suit. I'm going to talk today a bit about the underlying legislative requirements that employers must comply with respect to ensuring that they have safe workplaces. So the first here is the Ontario Human Rights Code, and the second is the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So turning to the code first, what is it? It's a code, it's a piece of legislation, and it's law here in Ontario. It protects all employees and requires that employers must ensure that there is a safe workplace free from discrimination, harassment, including sexual harassment. If we flip the slide, the code actually defines harassment and sexual harassment in detail. You can see here that harassment is defined as a course of vexation, comment, or conduct that is known or ought reasonably to be known. So that's a big key here, what a reasonable person would expect in the circumstances, to be unwelcome based on one of the prohibited grounds. Now, the prohibited grounds under the code are a variety of 13 characteristics: race, gender identity, sex, sexual orientation, family status, all of those things. And those grounds are protected under the code. As you can see here, this obviously translates to real world, don't do something that you would not feel comfortable being in receipt of. Again, if we flip the slide, the code also defines what sexual harassment is. This is a newer addition to the code, and it's one that you often find in workplace policies on harassment. There's the definition of the code for both harassment and sexual harassment. Now, this also encompasses reprisal. So, if an advance is made, the code explicitly prohibits an employer or one of their supervisors or managers from making any kind of reprisal against the person who faced or endured this kind of conduct. So, what is harassment? Harassment really encompasses a lot of things. It can be verbal, physical, or visual. It can be directed at someone, or it could just be general comments in the workplace that make other people uncomfortable, and what some lead to describe as a poisoned workplace environment. Now, the victim doesn't actually even have to object to the harassment. They just might be witness to certain comments, witness to certain jokes, anything that, again, going back to the definition, what a reasonable person views not to be unwelcome or wanted. Again, here we have slides on, just examples of sexual harassment. A lot of circumstances you'll hear cases that dealt with, shop talk or guy talk, where it's not directed at anyone in particular, but it's still unwelcome. Pictures of bikini girls on calendars. That's not normal, that's not welcome, and that creates and generates a culture where certain members don't feel safe or welcome in it. A lot of things listed on this slide is pretty straightforward and expected, but just to walk you through some of the points. So what does this mean for employers? Under the code, all employers are required to maintain a harassment and discrimination-free workplace. And this also encompasses the fact that employers can actually be liable for the actions of its employees. So oftentimes when I'm dealing with a human rights complaint, the complaint will be made both against the organization itself and a specific named respondent that the employer is deemed to be vicariously liable for. So something to think about, especially in the context of training. You want to have, especially your senior management, your supervisors, you need them to be trained on their obligations under the code because it's really under their watch that these day-to-day occurrences can happen. So they need to understand both what is proper conduct, how to respond to it, and the company's obligations under the law. Now, as we enter the holiday season, this is an important point to remember as well. The workplace isn't just the 4 square walls of your physical office building. It extends beyond and outside it. So harassment can take place in a variety of forms, both in the office and outside the office. So example, business trips, lunches, anything like that, especially, as we're in December, holiday seasonal parties. Another form too, Facebook, social media, private messaging between employees is not at work, it's not through a work-related software or program. It still can be deemed to be workplace behavior that the employer is responsible for and has to take steps with respect to. I've touched on this point before, but retaliation and threats and reprisals. This can be part of a complaint or a proceeding. Now, the code explicitly provides protection to every person to enforce their rights. So if someone makes a complaint, the employer is required to take it seriously, investigate it, and not retaliate against it. We have a question here about what happens when on a termination meeting someone raises a complaint about harassment. And that's a really difficult question. We deal with it a lot in the employment world. Because you as an employer, you have a duty to take all complaints seriously and investigate them. But the timing is sometimes can be suspect. So again, in those types of situations, the duty to hear the complaint, understand the allegations, have a detailed picture of what the allegations are, and to follow the company's policies and procedures and look into it and investigate the matter, they're still relevant and they still follow through even though that person has been terminated. So meeting the duties set out in the code, what do you have to do to determine that the employer's actually met their duties? And what will actually help when an employer is facing a human rights complaint? The things that really do go in an employer's favor to show that they've taken their requirements seriously, that they've put in procedures in place to address and deal with harassment and discrimination in the workplace, that they promptly dealt with any kind of complaint, that they seriously dealt with the complaint. So examples of this are, having a policy in place that's reviewed every year, having a complaint mechanism spelled out in the policy, undertaking an investigation and providing the findings of that investigation in writing to both the complainant and the respondent. So often when I'm preparing, responses for employers dealing with these types of situations, we will actually append their policies and their complaint mechanisms to their response to show that this organization takes its obligations seriously, has these steps in place, and actually followed and went through and met these obligations and took these steps. Now, another topic that's interesting and I'll touch on briefly is what about harassment or inappropriate behavior by outsiders, by non-employees, so clients or customers. There's a recent case dealing with the TTC and Twitter. TTC had a Twitter account where members of the public could tweet comments and suggestions to the TTC, and a lot of them turned out to be quite, bullying, harassing type behavior that was really, difficult for the TTC employee manning the Twitter account to deal with. And this is a unionized context, went to arbitration, and it was determined that TTC had an obligation to protect its employees from that type of conduct and that type of conduct and comments. So this is something else to remember too, that your policies and procedures should extend to everyone who comes in contact with your employees and how to protect those employees. Turning now to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, this is another piece of legislation here in Ontario, but as I said, it's province-wide, or Canada-wide, there's various pieces of legislation in every province. It imposes real training and investigation obligations on employers. So you can see here on the first slide, it has a similar definition of harassment in the workplace. It also covers violence in the workplace and domestic violence in the workplace. I'm not going to touch on that today, but that's just something to be aware of as well. The definitions of harassment and sexual harassment are very similar to the code. So often when employers are preparing their policies, they reference both of these legislative requirements in their policies. So you can see here on this slide, really under the OHSA, employers are obligated to undertake an assessment of their workplace. They need to put in place, by law, policies with respect to workplace harassment and violence, and procedures with respect to that, with respect to complaints. These policies must be updated yearly, and training needs to be undertaken with respect to the policies. The baseline that I've been talking about today with respect to this legislation is, at the end of the day, all employees in Ontario and across Canada are entitled to a workplace that is free from sexual harassment. And employers have a responsibility to ensure that no one is exposed to this type of behavior. So what this means, courts, legislators, tribunals, they all take harassment, bullying, and sexual harassment very seriously. Employers can face complaints at the Ministry of Labour, at the Human Rights Tribunal, and through civil suits with respect to allegations of bullying and harassment. So employers really need to implement strong policies that prohibit this type of behavior and train their staff on the importance of understanding these obligations. Now, we've talked about the reputational risks, and Dawn's talked a bit about the legal risks as well, but there's some case law that I'll allude to, one of them being a recent case with Walmart that had one of the largest damage awards in Canada with respect to bullying in the workplace. The court awarded a supervisor who was bullied, complained of that bullying to Walmart. Walmart did nothing, and she ultimately brought her case to court. The court awarded $1 million in punitive damages. Now, this was reduced to $100,000 in punitive damages on appeal, but it still shows you the significant monetary risk, not including reputational risk, that employers can face if they don't deal with complaints seriously. We had a question that came in about how to deal with a repeat harasser. Now, this is a very fact-specific issue. Someone who faced an allegation 10 years ago versus someone who had unwanted conduct 10 months ago, received training on it, and then repeated that conduct. It's really fact-specific and hard to comment on in a specific way. But really, it depends on it goes back to this definition of harassment, what was known or reasonably ought to be known. So if you have trained all of your employees on what your policies entail, what is harassment, and an individual carries out conduct that is explicitly, against your training, you are in a very significantly enhanced position for termination or measures of discipline. Again, it's hard to comment, but you have to, again, look at it with the facts in mind. Now, turning to the investigative process, the OHSA mandates that investigation take place, that the results be in writing to both the complainant and the respondent, and that this be done in a timely and fair and transparent manner. On the next slide, I've provided a high-level summary of what stages should what steps should be undertaken in a complex investigation. Really here, this is a review of the complaint, understand the nature of the allegations, interview both the complainant and the respondent, and any potential witnesses. Separate those interviews, do them confidentially, and remind everyone involved in the process of the confidential nature of the process. The investigator will then ultimately come to some kind of determination about whether harassment occurred in the workplace, and will prepare a report summarizing their findings and conclusions. Those conclusions alone, not the entire report, but just the conclusions, are then to be shared with the complainant and the respondent. And corrective action be undertaken. Corrective action can be a range of measures, ranging from training to coaching to a change in workplace to up to leading to termination. Now, we have a question here as well from a listener. What if a complainant doesn't want to come forward? This is a really tricky area because as part of the investigation process, and then what I've been saying earlier, is it needs to be a fair process. You have to understand the particulars of the complaint. And if that complainant doesn't want to come forward and provide them, the employer is often left in a difficult situation. So there's a few scenarios that could happen here. In one, if the alleged interaction was actually witnessed by a supervisor, that supervisor would have enough knowledge to have actually provide full details about what happened to investigate it. However, if you're still stuck in the position where you don't have the requisite knowledge of the details of the complaint, the employer can still undertake certain steps. And the steps really are undertaking a workplace culture review or investigation. So while you don't know the specifics of what went on, you can look and undertake an investigation of the entire culture so that you're not going after anyone in particular, but that you are undertaking steps to show that you knew of something, you didn't know what, but you undertook steps to look into it, to make sure that your workplace was safe, and to properly document it. So I'm going to finish up here. I know I've presented a lot of information. I hope it's helpful. These are just, as I said, the basic legislative requirements that employers should be aware of and encompass in their day-to-day operations and policies. So if there's any questions, I welcome them, but I'll continue on to Pam.
That's great. Thanks, Meg, for all of that. And thank you for touching on the investigation side of the complaint. And John, what if after the investigation it remains unclear what precisely happened? What's next?
Yeah, I'll just step back from that a little bit and remind everybody that if we're talking about an alleged assault, there is no legal limitation period. So that can complicate the matter very significantly as well, because the employer may be dealing with an allegation relating to something that happened 10 years ago and still has to investigate it, take it seriously, notwithstanding the problems that the passage of time presents. It may be that the employer, in difficult circumstances, in an investigation, has to retain an outside investigator to look into the matter, in which case it had better be a very experienced person, probably a former senior police officer who does these sorts of investigations all the time, so that you minimize the chances of making a mistake in the investigation, coming to a wrong conclusion and taking the wrong action, or failing to take the right action. So then we come to the situation which all employers would find loathsome, but can happen, where after all of this has been done, and let's assume that they've complied with the legislation, done a proper investigation, and spent the time on it and the money on it and taken it seriously, and they still don't know for sure what happened, and therefore they don't know what to do about it, that's where our add-on suggestion, which doesn't spring from the legislation but is certainly not prohibited by the legislation, comes in, and that is to appoint an independent mediator arbitrator, preferably a former judge with broad experience, in whom people have confidence, to conduct a mediation arbitration on the subject and come up with findings and recommendations. Now, it has to be emphasized that the parties to the complaint, the person making the complaint and the person against whom the complaint is made, would have to agree to proceed with that mediation arbitration. It also has to be emphasized that this, in practical terms, has to be at the company's expense. The company would have to pay for the mediator arbitrator's services, And if the parties, complainant or the person complained about, wanted to have counsel, which they probably would, the employer would have to pay for that as well. If you're in a situation in which you do all that, you say, look, we're trying to be fair here, we're going to put this before former Justice Smith, I'm just choosing a name at random, who has a very good reputation in dealing with these matters. It'll be mediated, arbitrated, and we'll try to come to a resolution, and if one of the parties, complainant or person complained about, refuses that, even though it would have been at no expense to them, then, of course, that's a factor that the employer can take into consideration as well. But in any event, the point of all this is to keep it out of the courts and out of the Human Rights Tribunal, if possible, where it will take a long time to get resolved, put it on a fast track toward what hopefully would be a more not only expeditious but efficacious determination of what should be done, and all the while the employer is able to say, and this is very, very important for media relations, that they're doing everything they can to get it resolved. So what would have to happen at that point is that if we were retained by the employer to deal with this, we would try to set up the mediation arbitration, try to facilitate the appointment of counsel for the parties who are at odds, and try to expedite the thing and make sure, in working with a good organization such as National, that that story gets out there so it's a positive story about the employer dealing with the matter as best they can in difficult circumstances and attempting to deal with it very, very expeditiously.
That's great. Thank you, Don, for discussing Aird Berlis's novel solution to this difficult and delicate issue. And we believe that this process is a way to resolve these difficult situations while avoiding costly, lengthy, and publicly damaging court battles. We were wondering if you could discuss the overview of how Aird Berlis, what they could offer to an employer in these situations.
Well, first of all, every situation will be different. So our recommendation is, if you have any doubt that you are in a good position to deal with a potential crisis, if you have any doubt that your systems are in place as required by the legislation, or if you just want them reviewed, then that could be audited. Somebody like Megan would go in, make suggestions, and I might add that if you think that your media relations arrangements could be spruced up a little, then I'm sure National would be more than able to go in and say, look, have you got a chain of command here? Who's in charge? How do you deal with this? And have you got somebody ready to go in media relations? Because time is of the essence, as both Jane and Melissa have pointed out. So the first thing is an arbitration, I should say an audit, and if that reveals that certain steps have to be taken, then training within the workplace could be recommended and improved as well. Investigative capacity would certainly be something that would be looked at very, very carefully, and if having access to a good outside investigator, as I say, a senior former police officer would be best. That can be dealt with as well. And then last but not least, resolution capacity. Is the employer likely to be in a position to determine what happened and take steps to have the matter resolved, or is it more likely that they're not, in which case having in advance access to the mediator arbitration process would be very important. So it's really a question of taking a look at what's there, seeing if it's adequate, seeing what has to be done to improve it, and then implementing those improvements.
That's great. Thank you, Dawn. And you touched on what National can offer as well. I'm wondering if Melissa and Jane could discuss that further.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. So Melissa will be talking about this, the crisis playbook, a little bit later. Dawn had mentioned that's something that you can do to bolster and put more rigor around media relations and getting out in front of the story. The other thing that we can do is just help you understand what is happening in the media. As mentioned off the top, I was a journalist for almost 40 years, and in the last 10 of my career, media changed dramatically. The way we told our stories changed dramatically, and how we gathered news changed dramatically because of social media. And I think that's something that you need to have a little understanding around that, figure out what the media landscape looks like these days in order to be able to frame responses and to figure out how you can get in front of a crisis situation or a MeToo situation. So that also involves something that we do a lot is media training. Providing confidence, providing tactics, providing strategies for people to be dealing with the media, either print media or on-air interviews, or even social media interviews, or as simple as tweets or Facebook posts. I mean, those are all the different kinds of things that we can help you grab your narrative, and get out in front of a story. Because as Dawn said, time is of the essence in these kinds of situations, and so you want to be flexible, nimble, and reactive, and those are the things that public relations companies like ourselves can help you with. Melissa?
Yeah, we really can't say enough that the most important part of crisis management is planning and preparation. So Jane and I and our team at National work with clients across virtually all sectors to develop effective playbooks and plans. And those playbooks and plans include, things such as scenario planning, so developing different scenarios and, addressing how each one should be handled, proactively drafting messages that align to each of those scenarios. We look at roles and responsibilities, so identifying who is responsible for what, who those key decision makers are, what the flow of information is, and who those spokespeople should be in the event of a crisis. We work with clients on developing templates from everything from internal communications to press releases. We develop holding statements for media. We also look at media protocol, as Jane mentioned, and social media is really important. And we work with our clients on developing a response plan, which is quite in depth and detailed, that captures what should be what could be shared or said on social media, and when to engage and what to say in those instances.
That's great. Thank you, Melissa. Dawn and Jane, sorry. Dawn, did you want to talk very briefly about the advantages for the employer in this situation?
Yeah. So what you do is plan for the worst and hope for the best. And it actually can be, as strange as this may be to contemplate, it actually can be an opportunity for the employer to come out of it looking good, because they've dealt with it properly. They didn't cause the problem in the first place, and they've done everything they can to come to a quick and fair resolution. Some who are viewing this or listening to this webinar may remember when Maple Leaf Foods got into this, had nothing to do with sexual harassment, got itself into a terrible situation with tainted meat. But fortunately, they got on top of it, they dealt with it, and they came out looking a much better company than they went into it. So the takeaways with regard to harassment and that sort of thing are, as far as I'm concerned, the following. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So have the systems in place that Megan has described in some detail. It's your legal obligation, but it's also very good business to make sure they're going to work. Number two, be prepared. Be ready to pounce on the situation when it comes up, both in terms of your legal obligations and the things that you have to do there, but also in terms of media relations. And I can't emphasize enough the correctness of what National has said here today. It has to be very, very timely. Number three, have lines of command in place so that you're not fumbling around when the crisis hits. know who is going to be dealing with what, both legally and in terms of media relations. Number 4, be able to respond quickly and effectively. Have a plan, and the people who are in charge need to know what the plan is and be ready to carry it out. And last but not least, what I alluded to earlier, try to think of it in terms of a crisis being an opportunity, not just a disaster, but an opportunity to make the employer look good, dealing with things fairly, expeditiously, complying with all their legal obligations, and in the case of the mediation arbitration add-on that we're suggesting, going beyond that in order to deal with the crisis.
That's great. Thank you, Don. I think we probably have time for a few questions. Yeah. Jane, did you want to answer the one about Facebook and the statement, considering John Ghameshi's Facebook statement, what are the risks to the alleged harasser making a statement?
Yeah, thanks for that. It came in from one of the participants in the webinar, so we appreciate the question. I had said that, and so is Dawn, that alacrity is the name of the game, being nimble and flexible and responding as quickly as possible in these situations to get in front of it. So Jean Ghameshi did that. We're all familiar. He was our the former CBC broadcaster, is Canada's sort of MeToo prime example, and this was something that happened, a situation that occurred in 2014, so long before the Harvey Weinsteins of the world, so it happened here in Canada. And when Jean Ghameshi, when it looked like things were going south for Mr. Ghameshi, he tried to get in front of it by posting a very long, I think 1,500-word Facebook post talking about what the situation was at CBC, the fact that there had been some allegations against him about his sexual preferences, the way what he liked to, how he participated in sexual acts, and he tried to get in front of that, and he did for the most part for a day when his Facebook post was out there all on its own. It looked like he had a lot of sympathy. People were fairly sympathetic with him. They understood that everybody's different. This is the way he does things, and he had support. But what he didn't say in that Facebook post, and what he didn't do and own up to, was the fact that there were 3 women who had brought allegations against him, and so that sort of came from blindsided a lot of people, and the public support turned against him. So that's the risk. His Facebook post and his explanation, because it didn't feel sincere, it was not transparent as transparent as it could be, it backfired on him. I'd mentioned earlier that Steve Paikin did the same thing when he was accused of sexual harassment. He wrote a very long and very well written, just as Ghameshi's was, Facebook post. But in that case, it really rang true. People had a sense of Steve Paikin. What he said was very credible. It appeared sincere. And in that case, Steve Paikin remained on air as TVO did its investigation. And as I said, that a few months after the allegations were made, Steve Paikin was cleared of the allegations, and his stellar career continues. So that's the risk. And people aren't stupid. Readers aren't stupid. People who are reading, following social media are not stupid. They can tell when statements are parsed, when words are kind of spun in a way. Like, people know that. So to be clear and honest and transparent and accountable, that's the way to go, because otherwise people are just going to keep pulling on the thread, and eventually the truth comes out.
That's great. Thank you, Jane. Megan, did you want to answer a few questions for us as well?
Sure, thanks. We've got a few questions here, one being how to deal with a harassment complaint that really is more about management feedback and not really harassment. We see this a lot day to day in workplaces, and it really comes down to a personality level in the interaction between a manager and their direct supervisor. We explicitly put in the policies, our harassment policies, that management and coaching is not a form of harassment. So, it's quite clearly set out and stated in these policies that reasonable management of your workplace in a respective manner is not harassment. So that can be quite easily dealt with and addressed. Another question here, what if the complainant is actually in a civil suit from a terminated employee after the fact against an individual, not the employer? Again, we see this a lot, unfortunately. Two things. One, as I said before, the employer is deemed to be vicariously liable for the actions of its employees. So that's why training, policies, all of what we've been going through are so important. But two, this is again where having those procedures in place are useful. If the employer had a complaint mechanism and the person never used it or brought their complaint forward despite receiving training and having knowledge about it, that's something that you can bring up in the suit and point to the fact that this is all after the fact, nothing was raised during employment that really has led to prejudice to the employer to actually properly investigate and deal with it. Last question we've got, and again, one that we deal with regularly. The question is, in the example of harassment in a poisoned workplace environment in the form of pin-up bikini girls, is consideration given to the work environment? For example, what if it's an all-male industrial site? Well, I actually dealt with this very example at an all-male industrial site where, the shop was decorated with these posters. It was all men in the workplace. However, there was one single female employee in the front of the shop, and she happened to walk into the back industrial room and saw these pictures and made a complaint, and it actually went to the tribunal. So, again, encourage a respectful workplace, even if it is an all-guy environment.
That's great. Thank you, Megan. And thank you, everyone, today for joining us. It's apparent by the discussion today that workplace sexual transgressions are one of the most challenging workplace issues that employers face. And hopefully our webinar will assist you in navigating this difficult issue if it arises. It is clear based on what we heard today that employers need to move forward on this issue now, proactively transforming the organization's culture, and not only after they receive a complaint. It may be too late by that time. I want to thank our magnificent panel for joining us today and providing us with all their experiences and insight on this important topic. I also want to remind everyone that we will be conducting another complimentary webinar on Wednesday, January 16, 2019, Top Workplace Issues of 2018, looking back and preparing for the year ahead. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a wonderful day.